Welcome to Black Hat Briefings, held November 21st through the 22nd, 2001 in Amsterdam. This is videotape number K2, Keynote Address, Politics of Vulnerability Reporting.
Good morning. Jeff just reminded me of a quick change I wanted to make on my slides before I get started, so that's why we're off there for a sec. Just, it's never complete until you've made the last change. So we'll jump right into it. As Jeff said, I'm Scott Blake. I'm the Director of Security Strategy for BindView Corporation. For those of you who don't know BindView, we make vulnerability assessment software, and if you're interested in BindView, I encourage you to take a look at our website, www.bindview.com. I won't give an ad, but you can take a look if you're interested. So we're going to talk this morning, as Jeff said, about the politics of vulnerabilities, and the issue we had thought, as Jeff said, was pretty well put to rest at one point. But it's raised its head again in a number of forums, the most interestingly of which was just a couple of weeks ago at the Trusted Computing Forum, which Microsoft sponsored out in California. And I should give you a couple of disclaimers first as to where I'm coming from on this question. BindView does conduct vulnerability research. We operate the Razor security research team that is under me, and we have skin in the game, as we say, for vulnerabilities. We are not a neutral observer of what's taking place, and so you should keep that in mind as part of the perspective that I'm bringing here. But I am trying to be fairly objective in looking at it, giving you more of a descriptive kind of picture as opposed to a prescriptive kind of picture. About what the situation is really like. And so to that end, here's what we're going to cover. Just a quick sort of what is politics, what is it that the subject matter is here. For those of you who don't remember Introduction to Political Science from your university days, just a quick there. And cover the description of what things have looked like historically and how they look now in terms of who the players are, what the ideologies in play might be, what the ideas are, and some policy initiatives that have been taking place over the last few years. And then at the end, I'll talk about what we think the future might look like in terms of the trends that are driving things forward, as well as some probabilities for different kinds of outcomes. So just a quick intro to politics here. Politics is the study of power. And power is typically defined as the ability to make someone do what they would not otherwise do. So that's a good working definition. It comes in a lot of forms. Power is actually the subject of a lot of academic discussion. And it used to be that you'd think of it primarily in terms of military power or force, being the way that you hold a gun to somebody's head and you make them do what they wouldn't otherwise do. But there's a much more textured understanding. Some of you will probably remember some names like Foucault from your university days, who talk about a much more complicated picture of power as existing in the interstices of human relationships. And we don't need to go into all of that at this point, but just keep in mind that we're really talking about how people are making other people do things and what interests are in play and how they go about doing things. A couple of important terms for you that are important to understand that I'll be using through the talk. Actor, which is someone who uses or is subject to power, so we'll talk about how the actors in vulnerability reporting, who they are, what their motivations and interests are. Ideologies being the set of beliefs or ideas. Legitimacy, which is an interesting concept. Essentially, the definition here is a dictionary definition. It's in accordance with established standards or patterns. And it really has a lot to do with traditions and sort of what's accepted as being understood as being an okay thing to do. And authority is defined as legitimate power, which is typically considered to be the sole province of governments. And it's in some cases actually a definition of what a government is in that it is a legitimate wielder of power. By the way, I am going to try to have time for questions at the end, so if you have any questions as we're going along, please jot them down and be sure to ask at the end. Hopefully we'll have time for that. If not, grab me in the hallways. I'll be around all day. So the ideologies that are in play here for vulnerability reporting are essentially three and one variant of one of those. Full disclosure, responsible disclosure, and zero disclosure. And zero disclosure has a variant which is limited disclosure. I'll talk about each of those in a little bit of detail. Full disclosure is the one that probably most of us are the most familiar with. And it has a couple of basic ideas. It comes from the idea, first off, that information wants to be free, that it will find a path to being released to the most number of people possible whenever that's possible. And so the idea of trying to keep something secret is at best a fool's endeavor. Right? It won't stay secret. You can't keep a secret. There's a rather famous quote of that in reference to the U.S. government that if more than two people know something, then it's not a secret. Right? And it's not unrelated to this concept of information wanting to be free. Part also of what it makes up the ideology of full disclosure is the idea that you want to use the power of public opinion to make vendors improve their code, to improve the security of their products. You do that by embarrassing them. And there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that this is the case. Microsoft used to be one of the worst vendors for receiving vulnerability information. There were reports of vulnerabilities in their software were met with threats of lawsuits, threats of cutting off business relationships wherever that was applicable. But they couldn't get away with that sort of thing because the public wouldn't let them. They were more embarrassed by the fact that there was a vulnerability in the software and the public knew about it, that people were saying, hey, you know, your software that you sold me sucks and now I can't do the stuff that I wanted to do. So you need to be able to improve that. And that public opinion has really driven Microsoft to now be one of the best companies. They have a 24/7, all the time staffed security response center. They investigate every single vulnerability report that comes into that. They verify whether it's true. They have a whole very detailed business process for dealing with vulnerability information. And that business process includes not only the technical aspects of testing the vulnerability and getting the information to the developers and to getting patches out or workarounds or whatever the case may be, but also it says some PR control. So there's some aspect of how it interacts with the business, not just with the technology. There's also the piece in full disclosure, as it's typically understood, as including exploit code in the release of information. So it's not just an English language description of a vulnerability, but it includes a piece of code. And oftentimes that piece of code is not just demonstration that there's a vulnerability, but actually how to exploit it. And we often make that distinction, or it's an important distinction to me, which will become clear a little bit later, that between proof of concept code being something that will show you that, you know, if you send this kind of a connection and you get back this kind of information, that indicates that something has happened. If you overflow this buffer and you see, if you see a whole bunch of A's in the buffer, or what is it, the 04s, whatever the ASCII code is for it, then something has happened, right? But we all know it's pretty easy in most cases to just plug in shellcode to that and off you go, right? So part of full disclosure, though, is the idea that you want to get this code out to as many people as possible so they can test for vulnerability, as well as demonstrate to superiors in the organization or whoever needs to be able to see it that the problem actually exists. This issue of exploit code is a key issue that we're going to come back to on some of the other vulnerabilities. So who follows full disclosure? Mostly nonprofit researchers, that being people who research vulnerabilities in their spare time or as a hobby. So amateurs who are not necessarily professional researchers, but may have a day job or something. We'll talk in more detail about who those actors are, as well as very few, but some commercial researchers, and not very many other people. Responsible disclosure is closely related to full disclosure, in that the idea is that you still want to have a broad dissemination of vulnerability information to improve security awareness, not only on the part of consumers of the software that has the security flaw, but also on the part of developers who are building software. And that's an important point, actually, because a lot of the motivation behind giving out information is really the academic pursuit of improving software engineering practices, which is both an academic pursuit and a real-world pursuit of people actually trying to go out and build better code. And we also are using the disclosure of this to affect public opinion, to force vendors to improve their development practices. However, it has the important change from full disclosure in that what was responsible disclosure, and put heavy quotation marks around all of these terms, right? Because they are all laden with a lot of implications for the meaning and who's doing the right thing and so forth. But typically, responsible disclosure does not include exploit code. It may include proof of concept code where it's possible to demonstrate a vulnerability without actually exploiting it and without making it very easy to transform that code into something that can actually exploit the problem. And it's an important distinction because you may be able to show, for example, again, just with buffer overflows is an easier example. I'm sure it's something that we're all familiar with. Showing something that crashes the server, whatever the listening program is, but doesn't actually get to where the buffer is. It may be very difficult to find what the right offsets are and what have you. And so you would really not be helping anybody out who wouldn't be able to figure it out for themselves anyway. You're not arming the script kiddies. And this is an important point because one of the criticisms of full disclosure is that you're putting tools into the hands of the script kids, of people who don't want to do anything except wreak havoc on the internet. Okay. So the adherents here are most commercial researchers. BindView is an adherent of this practice. Just so you all know. And some notable software vendors are actually supportive of this kind of an approach, where as long as the exploit code isn't out there to actually make things more dangerous in the world, then the disclosure of a significant amount of information is actually useful, and they understand that use. Zero disclosure is the other end of the spectrum, and there are quite a few people who actually buy into this, although not many of them are in this room, I would venture to guess. But there are some interesting aspects to this, and the central piece of it is actually the second bullet under tenets there, which is really that the authors of software should control the information relating to that software. That if I find a flaw in whatever piece of software, say BindView software, BindView is a software manufacturer. If somebody finds a flaw in that software, their responsibility is to tell me about it, and that's it. Their responsibility ends with notifying me. It is my responsibility as the manufacturer of the software to do the right thing and fix that problem and make that fix available to my customers, but not necessarily to tell them anything about it. That the public, the customers, my customers, the users of my software, should install the patch. They should trust me as the vendor. We can all have a little chuckle at that one, right? They should trust me that the patch is actually important and that they need to do the right thing and install that patch. We happen to know empirically that they don't, of course, but that's not really the point here. Is that this is a prescriptive thing. You should do that. Okay. And it's interesting here that you notice who the adherents are. Most software vendors, or many software vendors, lots of government components. Most governments actually take this point of view that there's no real point in allowing anything to come out about these software flaws that isn't directly applicable to installing the patch. People should do the right thing and just trust the other people in the interaction to also be doing the right thing. And the public falls into this category too, mostly because they don't understand. To the extent that anybody thinks about it, which is not a very great extent, of course, they tend to think that, you know, they see NIMDA, they see code red, and they say this is bad, and that's where the thinking about it stops. This information was known. That's bad. And those of us in the States saw a lot of this stuff in the post-September 11th news, where people were amazed that anyone could go out and get flight training, could learn how to fly a commercial airplane and take these classes and be able to navigate the thing around. And everyone was very surprised by this for no really good reason, except that there was a bad outcome. And it's the bad outcome is the only part that people see. So there's an important variation of zero disclosure also, which is limited disclosure. And this is also a much more interesting, is implemented actually quite widely, more widely than zero disclosure. It's basically the same idea, except that the sharing of information is good and desirable on a need-to-know basis and within peer groups. So this is the foundation of what we have in the States called the ISACs, which is information sharing in something consortiums. There are a couple of notable ones, particularly in the financial industry. A lot of the banks, the big banks especially, and other insurance companies and so forth have the financial ISAC, and they share a lot of information about vulnerabilities and attacks and other security relevant information with each other only. With each other and with law enforcement only. And the U.S. FBI has tried to put together an initiative called InfraGard, where they share information with other companies more broadly, and there's a whole growth in the ISAC environment, and I'll talk a little bit later about what some of the problems with that approach are. But the idea here is basically that there's no disclosure outside of what they would term responsible parties, people who have, again, skin in the game, that have a need to know the information, but aren't going to be disseminating it any more broadly than that. Okay. So I put up this little chart here. I whipped this up yesterday, and you'll notice, by the way, I'm sure you've noticed already, that the slides don't quite line up with what you have in your books. The slides will be up on my website next week, and Jeff will have them up on the Black Hat site soon. But this little chart sort of sums up the last couple points here. Make it a nice little graphic representation. Good point of reference on these points. So, who are the actors? I'm going to talk about each of these in detail, so I won't run through the list now. First off, the vendors, the manufacturers of the software. Okay. They're very important, obviously, because they're the recipients of vulnerability information, and in a few cases they cross over between being researchers and vendors, such as BindU, so that it's an interesting position to be in. But so what are they about? Well, most of them are public companies, but even for private companies, the basic idea is to increase the value of the company. That's what most of us are in the business for. So they're trying to increase shareholder value, and that's the bottom line in most cases. It doesn't make any difference what the politics are, what the philosophy is. What the right thing to do is ethics and so forth usually play second fiddle to shareholder value and enhancing the sales of the company, which is often part of that as well. So the financing here is in software sales. There may be services as well that go along with it, but basically the general idea here is to sell more software. And their interests are primarily these three, to avoid, and this is the interests relative to vulnerability information, to limit damage to the brand, to limit the vulnerability of their customers, which is an interesting point, and of course to sell more software. A lot of people in the security community tend to brush over the second point there, which is the limiting of vulnerability to customers. But I'm putting forth to you today as part of my theory here that they actually do want to do that, not so much for the purpose of because it's the right thing to do, because they don't want the customers to be vulnerable, but more because they want the customer to be happy. Happy customers buy more software. That goes to increasing their software sales and selling more software. And so if you want your customers to come back and be customers again, then you want them to be happy and so to not be insecure, right? And they often, again, the power that they wield here, most of the time the vendors have a lot more leverage in with the media and with public relations than anybody else who's involved in the vulnerability process. And so they'll use that power to limit disclosure, to spin control, to make sure that the message that they want is the one that's coming out. But they will also try to use legal action in some cases. There'll be lawsuits in reference to violation of licensing. And also, you notice up here we have lobbying. The vendors tend to have a lot more money than the other people involved, and so are often much more active in lobbying organizations for getting the laws that they think are the right ones to come out. Again, the good example of that is the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which was created essentially by and for software vendors to protect the digital rights management technologies. Researchers are a broad category, so there's a lot of different aspects that go into this, but the basics are the same. The motivations are more or less the same, and it's pretty straightforward. Pushing forward the state of the art of security, and that's very similar to the sort of, we often think about people, especially kids and hackers, really being motivated by sort of climbing the mountain. Right? Why do you want to break into the DoD system? Because it's there, right? Because it's Mount Everest, and you want to do something that's challenging and interesting and is a noteworthy accomplishment. And that I include that as part of advancing the state of the art of security. Building more security, of course, is something that we're very interested in. That's often commercial researchers are in the business of advanced research projects for their companies, whether that's for software or for our customers in a consultative kind of position. And academics are often motivated by this as well. We want to build better stuff. And of course, building name recognition and peer respect is an important motivator. There's a community out there, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with, that people respect people who find interesting vulnerabilities and find a lot of vulnerabilities. That's a good calling card for somebody to have when they're looking for work in reverse engineering or penetration testing or anything along those lines. And name recognition is pretty much the same thing. You'll notice, by the way, this is very similar in concept to one of the interests of software vendors, which is to build brand, and it's essentially the same thing. It's reputation and respect. The financing picture is a little more complicated. These are or statements typically, not and. So the financing will be a day job or customers, whether that's grants being academic funding sources, contracts being people who are in consulting businesses. And of course, software sales are also an issue here for people who are working for software companies. There are a number of companies who are essentially software companies but also do vulnerability research. The interests are pretty straightforward. You want to continue the financing source. So you don't want to piss off your employer too badly. For those people who have a day job and they're working in something else, often system administration or programming, but are not directly related to the vulnerability research, they don't want to jeopardize their job in most cases. And so that often will lead to people using, pseudonyms and so forth. In the case of grant money for academic researchers, whoever the funding source is will have something to do with what they do, and so forth. And of course, maintaining and extending the reputation is a powerful interest for most of the researchers. So power relations. Hobbyists, this is pretty straightforward, are largely free from any external influence. The large software companies, the vendors, aren't going to really sue somebody who doesn't have anything to get. It's not usually worthwhile to do that. You know, Joe Hacker sitting off in his little loft someplace isn't likely to be the target of a lawsuit from Microsoft, because what are they going to get? They're not going to get anything out of it. The criminal charges they might be interested in pressing, but a lawsuit isn't worth it. It's too expensive. There's no return. Academic and consultative researchers, again, the primary motivator here is financing. They want to be able to make sure that the financing source doesn't dry up. You want to be able to get the grant next time, get the next contract from the customer. You want to be pretty careful not to do that, not to make anybody upset about that. And commercially sponsored, which would be the category that I fall into, are basically beholden to the company's interests. Whatever the company wants to do is really the bottom line. The company needs to be extending their shareholder value. They need to be increasing their sales, and so nothing that jeopardizes that is going to be allowed. Okay. And this is an interesting thing here is the underground, and I struggled with how to fit this into the presentation because it's a tricky concept. The underground here, by the way, I'm not referring to script kiddies primarily, but more to people who are doing looking for vulnerabilities for the purpose of being able to break into systems. And not people who are looking for just scripts that other people are doing, but people who are actually trying to reverse engineer software, to disassemble executables, or doing real work in trying to create new information about vulnerabilities to advance the state of the art. And so that's why I really put them in the category as a variant of researchers, in that they have pretty much the same motivations that we just talked about, but add to that a notion of being able to control systems or to control a piece of information, knowing something that other people don't. And a lot of times that's not something that they're going to brag about. These folks tend to be less motivated by reputation, except within the limited peer group, than other kinds of researchers. And financing, in most cases, it's going to be day job again, but there is also a growing element to which organized crime falls into this category. That the financing really comes from the criminal enterprise in general, so this is an aspect of that, and this is something I think that we're going to be seeing more of in the future. It's interesting because these folks tend to fall into the limited disclosure category in terms of their ideology. They don't want to publicly disseminate information about the vulnerabilities that they've discovered because they want to use those vulnerabilities to break into systems. They don't want the vendor to create a patch. They don't want to advance the state of the art of security. They actually want to hold things relatively constant where the systems are insecure and they're out there that they can be broken into quite easily. The more easily, the better, in fact. So that's an interesting variant on that. And there's very little way in which they have any influence over other people, except insofar as they may be extorting money from somebody. But they are a major factor, especially amongst the public and the media, which we're coming to in just a minute, in creating fear. These are the people that people are really afraid of. The ones who've downloaded. The guys who broke into CD Universe and downloaded 100,000 credit card numbers and then wanted to extort money from the company in order to not publish those numbers. So, governments are, of course, something you can't really talk about politics without talking about some aspect of government, and they are certainly a player in the field here. The primary motivation, and I'm sure there are some folks in the audience who are going to push back on me on this one, but I think the primary motivation is what I refer to as the technocratic perception of the public good. And most of the people that I know in government anyway would say that their motivation is the public good, but it's important to know where it comes from. The public good, by the way, in case anyone's not familiar with that term, is essentially the larger good of society, right? Whatever the best thing is for the most amount of people is the public good. And but the perception of this really comes through the government lens, where people are seeing things in terms of policies and laws that are going to influence behavior. And it's important to keep that in mind because they don't tend to see things in terms of the public good, right? Most of us would say the public good here is to build more secure software. But that building more secure software is very difficult to create in policy and legal regimes. And so that's often not the conclusion. And so the government interest is really that the public not be afraid, rather than any means of getting there. They're really more interested in the end product than any way of getting there, and always in relation to what is their perception of how policies and laws are going to work into that, or in the case of elected representatives, how it's going to get them reelected. The financing and interests are pretty self-explanatory. The only thing I would note here also is that public safety is an important component of this. The security of critical infrastructure is something that we talk about a lot in the States. Power grids, airlines, air traffic control systems, hospitals, water supplies, all that kind of stuff. And this is all before the recent terrorist attacks as well. The rhetoric is heated up recently, but it's the same stuff. And that public safety is an important aspect because it's also not something that really anybody else cares about. Most of the other players are not directly interested in public safety. And the power relations are pretty clear. The government, of course, is the source of authority. It is the legitimate wielder of power, and so as such, its primary tool for behavior is through policies and laws, and through the prosecution of people who don't adhere to those laws. But also, it's important to note that the government is a large customer of most software vendors. And this is a power that's not exercised very much, but is an interesting one to think about for the future, is how we can get governments to exercise the power of the purse, as we call it, of spending their dollars on more secure software and spending their dollars to develop more secure software. They used to do this for a while especially in the defense industries, when they would have specialized things built that were highly reliable and really designed for the purpose of being secure. And then have gotten away from that more recently as they started to use commercial software because it's cheaper and it's in the interest of more efficiency in government. Have really moved away from specific engineering and more toward what can we get from commercial vendors that's already close enough to what we need, and hopefully we'll be able to sort of not necessarily to get down into the middle of that. On the one hand, engineering things uniquely for government is not productive. It's a very inefficient use of resources. But on the other hand, just taking what the companies have to offer is dangerous, as most of us know. So pushing into the center where the government can use the governments can use their pocketbooks to improve what the software vendors are offering is an important concept. The media is something that a lot of us in the security industry like to complain about, but it's still an important player here. They're all about creating news, of course, and news is what the media lives and breathes. But also the financing, of course, is extremely important. And depending on what kind of an outlet that is, it could be subscription could be the main source of funding, or advertising could be the main source of funding. The media are, in many cases, beholden to their need to generate that revenue, and it's not necessarily a very easy thing to do in some cases. But generating more readers generates more advertising revenue or more subscribers, and that pushes them forward. And so as a result, they will often try to serve up to the readers what it is they want, and to provide for them more exciting information than it might otherwise be. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of that. I learned very early on as a vulnerability researcher that the media are generally not interested in vulnerabilities that are not being exploited in the wild. If we sit down and the Razor team and I are in our lab and we find something really scary, no one really cares until people start exploiting it. And a great example of that is the recent CRC32 attack in SSH. One of the BindView researchers discovered that back in February of this year. We wrote up a big advisory about it, everybody got their patches into the software, and that was it. There was no real coverage of that. Most of you in the audience here probably didn't even hear about it until the last several weeks when there was a script came out that started exploiting the thing on a wide scale. There actually got some press at that point, not very much because it's more Unix than Windows, but there was still some press around it. And people started talking about the vulnerability. Why? Because it was being actively exploited. It was just as bad in February as it is today, but people weren't actually using it then. The public is an interesting actor here, mostly in reference to what other people want out of the public. But I mention it just to give you a sense here of what's going on. And motivators and financing aren't particularly relevant in this case. There are too many factors to really make it to really have any coherent direction out of it. But the interests are interesting. The people do actually want stable and secure software, and my bellwether for that is usually my parents. My parents don't know anything about computers except that it crashes all the time, and they don't like that. They don't really care about whether they install the latest patches, there's a vulnerability. All they really want is for it to be there when they need it and not do anything that they don't want it to do. Pretty straightforward. But of course, the other side of that coin is they do want what I call the whiz-bang features, right? They would love it if it would get up and walk the dog for them. Right? They like it when it does nifty things that they didn't necessarily anticipate but are pleasantly surprising. Okay? And so that tension is exactly what most of the software vendors are trying to deal with. They're trying to support both ends of that spectrum, which are, as most of us know, are in direct conflict with each other. The more features you put into software, the more complicated it's going to be and the less likely it is to be stable and secure. Right? Central idea of anybody doing security engineering. The more complicated you make it, the less likely it is to be secure, end of story. Okay? And so but the public is demanding both. The public is demanding new features, they're spending money on new features, but they also complain a lot if it's not stable and secure. And so it's a very fine line that software vendors have to try to walk here, trying to provide for both of those, because the public is who's spending the money. Okay, so we've gone over the three main ideologies in one variant and the five main actors in one variant, getting these things into place. So what are some of the policy initiatives? I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit here. These are the four main ones that we're going to cover. Probably most of you are familiar with the Council in Europe Cybercrime Treaty. The idea of this thing is pretty straightforward: to harmonize and update European computer crime laws so that someone in the Netherlands doesn't have a different set of rules for somebody in Belgium and so forth. It's pretty straightforward. There's nothing particularly creative or innovative about it, and getting, of course, everybody updated as well. However, there are a couple of provisions within that treaty which are going to be interesting when we start to see the implementation of those into actually nation-state laws. Of course, the treaty does not bear the force of law. It's basically a set of suggestions for all of the countries that are signatories and other countries as well, actually, to update their own laws. And so there's a provision in there about what they refer to the tools of doing of doing computer crime. And the analogy that is often drawn here is essentially lockpicks. In the U.S. anyway, lockpicks are a regulated thing. You have to have a license. You have to be a licensed locksmith to go buy a set of lockpicks. You have to have the idea is you have to have a legitimate need to have these things in order to use them. And this is one of the provisions within the cybercrime treaty is that the possession of tools to break into systems, software tools to break into systems, with the intent to break into a system, is a crime in itself. Just having so if they come in, they raid your house, and they can establish that you had some intent, then the possession of Nmap might be grounds for prosecution. Now, what that means, of course, as most of us know, is extremely complicated. Whether the tool is something that is intended to help you break into a system or not is a very fine line. And one of the good examples people like to use is Nessus. Nessus, I'm sure most of us know, is a freeware vulnerability assessment scanner. What does it do? It creates, you point it at a system and you get back a list of all the vulnerabilities on it, which you can then use to break into the system. And Nessus happens to use primarily exploiting techniques to discover vulnerabilities, less inferential kinds of techniques for finding stuff. So they'll actually, in most cases, be launching the exploit. And in some cases, you can take that module out of Nessus and use it for just exploiting the vulnerability and getting you back a root shell. So what is that? Is that primarily something that has a nefarious purpose, or is it primarily something that you use for assessing the security of your systems? Good question. How is it going to be determined? And that kind of thing is going to be worked out in courts all over the world now as we start to figure it out. But is it what I'm calling out here as an unintended outcome is the idea that people may self-censor what they're doing in order to avoid the possibility of prosecution. None of us want to go to the jail, I assume. I certainly don't. And so I'm less, it may be that we're going to be less likely to do things that could be prosecuted if we're not sure where it's going to fall in the spectrum. Okay? So that could have a chilling effect that is slowing people down in doing things that they might otherwise do. And all throughout the treaty is language pertaining to the intent. So if I break into a system and my intent is to improve the security of that system and I have some authorization to do that, I can't be prosecuted. Right? If I'm working on if I'm pen testing, if I'm trying to break in, if I've been paid by a company to break into their systems, and I can demonstrate that I was paid and they authorized me to do this, then I can't be prosecuted. They're very careful to exclude that from the language of the treaty. But it may not be necessarily easy to establish that. There was a case in the U.S. a few years ago where a guy ran crack against the password database of a system that he used to be the system administrator of. He had this on his list of projects, and he moved from one section of the company to a different section of the company and finished up this project after he had already left. Cracked the password database and sent the file to the new administrator of the system and said, hey, I hadn't finished this up before I left. Here's the cracked database file, the cracked password file, go do the right thing. This guy was convicted of breaking and entering into a computer system, which is a felony in the United States, and had to do. He didn't actually have to go to jail, but he did have to do community service, and now can't pass a background check and any number of other things because he has a felony conviction. That is a problem for those of us who spend a lot of our days trying to figure out how to improve the security of our systems by breaking the security of those systems. And so I think that this is going to lead towards a more motivation for certification of security professionals. If I can show, I am a certified security practitioner and I'm working for this company, it's going to be much more difficult for doing something which is clearly a security practice. Even if it's not necessarily authorized, the specific thing is not necessarily authorized by management. If I can show that I'm adhering to a professional code of ethics and I've passed the test and I have the certificate hanging up on my wall, I'm going to be much more able to defend myself against those kinds of charges. I mentioned previously the ISACs, which are an important thing in the US. The idea behind these things is really to help companies stay one step ahead of the bad guys and to share information amongst people who have a need to know and share certain interests. There are a couple of them going. The financial one is the oldest one, but there's also one in the electrical power generation industry. There's one in the IT industry that's just getting off the ground. There are several others that are in the process of starting up. They work quite well. People are sharing information with each other. The Bank of America said, will happily tell Citibank that something's going on, and here's some information, we've seen this kind of an attack, and it works very well. The problem with these approaches is that nothing ever gets out of the ISAC, except sometimes to law enforcement, but then it stops there. They're not sharing information with anybody else who might have a need to know. They're not sharing information with their security vendors. They're not sharing information with somebody who's in the manufacturing industry who might very well have a need to know about these things as well, but they're not part of the ISAC, and so they don't get this kind of information. Now the idea is to be able to roll up information over time to larger sort of umbrella ISACs. So if you have the financial one and the manufacturing one and the electrical power one, then they would report up to another organization that would then disseminate information across the ISACs. We haven't seen any of that yet. It's unclear whether or not it's going to work. It's an interesting idea that's working quite well for the people who have the information, but it leaves other people, of course, out in the cold. Anyone who's not part of the ISAC doesn't get the information, and so it has two effects, one of which is of course, having all of these other people who are vulnerable to these problems and maybe vulnerable to these attacks but don't know about it, and are now the information have-nots. Right? And also, it creates an atmosphere in which people are less willing to discuss the security-relevant events that they're seeing around them, particularly with people who are part of an ISAC. It creates a culture where within the ISAC, people talk amongst each other quite freely, but outside the ISAC, they don't talk at all. They have the environment in which it's safe to share information, and everything's fine, and then in any other environment, it's not safe to share information, so they don't. And so less information gets out into the public than might otherwise be getting out. The disclosure forums. This is a really simple one, and it's probably something that we're all pretty familiar with. I'm talking here about BugTrack, NT-BugTrack, Win2KSec Advice, all of the big public boards for the discussion of vulnerabilities. It gets information out to a wide audience. These are all full disclosure kinds of places. People put out a lot of information. There's discussion about the technical information of vulnerabilities, and it's a really valuable resource for any security practitioner. The criticism that's leveled against these is primarily that it's putting information into the hands of people who don't need the information just as much as people who do need the information. That when you put an advisory out or an exploit code out for a vulnerability that you're distributing out to people via, say, BugTrack, for the purpose of being able to understand the vulnerability, secure their systems, install the patches, get the handle around what's going on, you're just as much putting that information into the hands of people who are going to use it to do bad things, and that's a bad thing. The Partnership for Digital Safety actually hasn't been announced yet. I was sort of hoping that it would be before it got out here, so I'm letting the cat out of the bag a little bit here, so bear with me. This was announced as an initiative at the Trusted Computing Forum a couple of weeks ago, not with this name, but it's going to have this name probably by the end of next week. There'll be a website and so forth. The idea here is a group of vendors and security companies, vulnerability researchers, that will adhere to a certain code of ethics and push for an RFC. The two RFCs, actually, one on the content of vulnerability advisories, and the other on the responsibility of software vendors to respond to vulnerability information. One of the things we've been trying to do really is to include both sides of the equation in the discussions. the idea is really to create a code of ethics and to make it more difficult for the bad guys to get information and to slow them down. There are basically three ideas that go along with this. The first is that all parties will handle vulnerability information responsibly, which means vendors will do the right thing when they get a vulnerability report. Second, that you observe a blackout period on the details of exploiting a vulnerability for 30 days after the availability of the patch. So right now, for example, when I put out an advisory, it says I have all the information in the advisory, but that advisory typically doesn't come out until the vendor patch is available. So if I find a flaw with something that Microsoft puts out, I call them up, I say, look, here's the problem, here's all the research that we did, check it out. They get back to us and say, okay, we found it, that we're working on the patch. A couple weeks later, okay, we've got the patch ready. We say, great, here's the advisory that we're going to send out. They say, great, here's the advisory that we're going to send out. We all get together, we say, okay, we're going to do it on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. And they release their patch and their advisory, and we release our advisory at the same time, 4 o'clock on Tuesday. Okay. In the future, that will be different because we will, I'm running out of time, yeah. We will be separating the vulnerability information by 30 days. So part one of the advisory will come out that just has general information about the vulnerability. Part two will then come out 30 days later and then have the more technical details of how it's done. And the third thing with this is that we won't release exploit code. As I said before, we don't release exploit code anyway, so that's really no change for us. It is a change for some other people. There are some unintended outcomes here. Limiting the availability of information is something that's possibly going to happen because of the group has been criticized as being really an effort by Microsoft to limit the exchange of information, which is sort of an unfair criticism because it wasn't even Microsoft's idea in the first place. But it is, I think, going to have some effect on limiting the information that people are putting out. It certainly is going to have some effect on that for us, probably for some other companies as well. Okay, I'm getting close to the end and I've got 4 minutes, so let's try to get through here. Some trends. There are 5 trends that I think are important here. We are seeing increasing legislation, which are having more clear definitions of cybercrime. A central question for these, of course, is are those definitions going to be good? Some of them are good, some of them are okay, some of them aren't. There was a bill that was discussed in the States in early October that would have defined any computer crime as terrorism and would have essentially meant that any kid who defaces a website could be facing a potential life sentence without the possibility of parole. Fortunately, that was defeated. But it was just disproportionate. That could have been a problem. Lost the microphone. That could have been a problem, of course, in any number of ways. Okay, so we are seeing, however, improving communication channels, primarily with the good guys. The good guys with the ISACs and so forth are sharing a lot more information with each other than they used to, and that's probably a good thing. However, the bad guys, the underground, have always been very good at sharing information amongst themselves and not letting that information out into the public, and that is continuing. We haven't seen any change in that respect. But it's taken the good guys a lot longer to get behind that thing, that concept. A lot more research is being done. We're seeing a lot more vulnerabilities coming out. The study that we did a year or so ago shows that the rate of new vulnerability announcements on BugTrack only has been increasing at about 90% per year. So roughly, slightly less than doubling every year since '92. That means that the average rate for the year 2001 is going to be in the neighborhood of 5 vulnerabilities per day being announced, and that will double next year, essentially. more vicious attacks. NIMDA was very aggressive in terms of having a lot of vectors for spreading, but was not terribly damaging, although it was very dirty. It did a whole bunch of things on the system. It changed registry keys, dumped files all over the place, infected executables, had a Trojan, et cetera. And that was very expensive to clean up because it was time consuming and complicated. And I think we're going to be continuing, we're going to see that continuing. And of course, the penetration of internet access. More and more devices are connected to the internet. Actually, I learned recently that in the next year, the number of devices that are managed, meaning corporate resources that have people whose job it is to maintain those systems, will become a minority of systems connected to the internet sometime in the year 2002 or so. That more unmanaged devices, that there isn't somebody who is taking care of that system professionally, there will then be more of those than things that people are taking care of professionally. And that has interesting implications for the maintenance of security of those systems and how we're going to be able to do that. And wireless internet devices play a major role in that. As we have more and more complicated phones that we can browse the internet with, and the processors and the software in those gets increasingly sophisticated, they're going to be more vulnerable. I had hoped to have a few minutes to discuss these possibilities, but instead I will just leave them with you as food for thought. Will the public demand security? They haven't yet. It's certainly something that they're thinking about, but demand would certainly be too strong to say that that's something that they're asking for. Who will pay for security? Who will pay for building more secure software? Will the customer pay for more secure software? There's a famous quote from Microsoft saying we could build a bug-free version of Microsoft Word, but it would take us 5 years and it would cost $5,000 and no one would buy it. Okay. So this is a question. In the States, we've been talking a lot about the war on terrorism, and it'll be interesting to see, I think, if something really bad happens if we get a war on hackers. We'll leave it at that. So here at the very end here, I don't think there are any major changes that are imminent in the state of vulnerability handling and security. We're going to see continued harmonization of laws, which is important for the politics of the thing. The continued creation and discovery. Creation meaning people are still going to be writing buggy software. There's no change on the horizon for that. We'll see continued mismanagement of flaws, meaning people are still going to not be installing patches. They're still not going to be handling the information about the flaws in their systems correctly. And we're going to see continued small-scale exploitation. There's some wide-scale exploitation, but most of the wide-scale exploitation doesn't really have very bad effects. And absent a catastrophe, no major changes. If we do see a catastrophe of some major proportions, and I hesitate to even speculate as to what that might look like, but unless something major happens that really galvanizes the public and the industry, it's unlikely, I think, that we're going to see any significant changes in the short to medium term. The software is going to just continue drifting to being more secure, but people are still demanding more complicated things, and so that they really offset each other. The increasing complexity and the increasing security makes it a wash. That's it. I was going to take questions, but we're out of time, so if you have any questions, please talk to me afterwards, and the slides will be up on razor.binder.com next week. Thanks.